Well, after those testimonies and Pastor Ryan's message, I feel like I probably don't even need to preach at all. But I have prepared something, so just buckle up for a second. I want to spend just a moment thinking about God's faithfulness for the future. I think it's really important, as Ryan was just saying, for us not to forget the ways that God has been faithful to a church, to us as individuals. But I do think the real test of faith comes with, what do you believe about the future? It's one thing to be able to look back on God's past actions, but when you think about the future, that's when it really comes down to, what do you believe about God's character? What do you believe about his nature and his heart? How do you know that he will not forsake you in the future? How do you know that his faithfulness will continue for future generations? It is our trust in God that allows us to have hope for the future. I think hope for the future is something we probably need. You know, I moved to San Francisco. Our family did at a very strange time. Alana and I came for our in-person interview in June of 2020. So you can imagine, San Francisco was a ghost town. We stayed in Union Square, and there was nobody else there but us. When our family came in late July for in view of a call, we had to meet outside in the parking lot in groups of 10 just to follow the protocols during the pandemic of that time. We had Zoom interviews with the entire church. That's really fun. 50 people just getting to ask you questions about how the Spirit has led you and your theology and all those things. But God called us to this church, and we really felt like we were very comfortable. We really felt like we were stepping into a great situation, because as we were in all those moments of seeing these groups kind of come together, we could tell that this was a church that really loved each other. We just got to see all these mini reunions take place as people emerged from their homes after months of isolation, and they visited with each other. And we got to just see that the church body kind of come together in different ways. But I do think, as much as we felt kind of comfortable about the community of this church, one of the major questions that's probably still being asked by many people today is, well, what is the future of San Francisco? I mean, ever since the pandemic, people have said, well, remote work has totally changed things. People aren't going to live in an expensive city anymore. People talk about a lot of the problems of our city that often make the headlines in the news. Stores are always closing. I mean, we're losing Macy's in Union Square. Thankfully for Ryan, Santung has survived, but a lot of our favorite restaurants haven't. I mean, a lot of people wonder, well, what is the future of San Francisco going to be? I think by nature, then we ask the question, well, what's the future of First Baptist Church of San Francisco? And I think I don't have the answers to all those questions, but I do think that this text provides us with the way that we're supposed to answer those questions. When we read this passage at the end of Psalm 107, there's actually this kind of turn. As Ryan was summarizing, really all throughout the beginning and really the leading up to verse 33, it is looking back on what God has done for his people, how he has redeemed his people, how he has been faithful. But in verse 33, there's this shift to not just what God has done, but what he does. And we just heard it in verse 33. It says that he turns rivers into a desert, springs of water into thirsty ground, a fruitful land into a salty waste because of the evil of its inhabitants. In other words, he says that he is in control of the land, and he can bring what is fruitful to nothing because of the wickedness and the sin there. But on the flip side, he is sovereign over the land, even for good things. It says in verse 35, he turns a desert into pools of water, a parched land into springs of water. There he lets the hungry dwell, and they establish a city to live in. They sow fields and plant vineyards and get a fruitful yield. By his blessing, they multiply greatly, and he does not let their livestock diminish. In other words, he can take a river and turn it into a desert, but he can also take a desert and turn it into a river. He is the one who establishes a city. And so if you want to take some notes, I just have three kind of implications that we see here at the end of Psalm 107 about how we should trust God for the future. And the first is that we trust God because he is sovereign. We trust God because he is sovereign. He is the one that establishes cities. He's the one that's in control of the land. He is the one who can turn a desert into a spring. He was the one who began to bring people to San Francisco about 175 years ago. He is the one who has established this city. He has at times probably brought this city to humble points. There's times he has blessed the city. One of the things that we have to keep in mind as we look to the future is that God is still in control. The same God who brought people here 175 years ago, the same God who established the city all this time is still on the throne. Our hope is not in our present circumstances. Our hope for our city is not in who we can elect into a position of power. Our hope for our city is not in a new wave of technology and innovation that we hope would draw people back here. Our hope as a church is not even in our own goodness and faithfulness in and of ourselves. Our hope is the fact that God is sovereign, that he is in control, that he has promised that he will not leave us or forsake us. He has promised that he will build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. God is the one in control. He is the one who gives us hope. Just to use the kind of cheesy old pastor cliche, we may not know what the future holds, but we do know who holds the future. We know that God is in control. And we see that he uses his sovereignty in particular ways. You notice that he was bringing these rivers and springs to be a desert because of the wickedness, but he was also raising up out of the desert an oasis. He was blessing those who were hungry. There's this way that God is using his sovereignty to bring down the proud and lift up the humble. This is continued in the next verses. Verse 39, it says, when they are diminished and brought low through oppression, evil, and sorrow. Meaning when there is evil in the land that brings people low, he pours contempt on princes and makes them wander in trackless wastes. But he raises up the needy out of affliction and makes their families like flocks. The upright see it and are glad, and all wickedness shuts its mouth. Notice that God in his sovereignty takes those who are high and he brings them low, and he takes those who are low and he brings them high. What does it look like to trust God with the future? We trust God because he is sovereign, but we submit to God because he blesses the humble. We should continue forward as a church, submitting to God because we recognize that God blesses the humble. God in this passage is doing what he always does. He opposes the proud. Those who are in positions of being princes and having power, they're not being brought low simply because of their position of power. They are being brought low because of their pride, because what they are doing with their power, to mistreat people, to oppress people, to not live according to God's way, but according to what fits them. And the reason that the hungry and the needy are being lifted up is not just because they were poor, because they're in a low position, but because they are humble. Notice it says it is the upright, those who are living according to God's design. They are the ones who rejoice in God's work. But the wicked, they shut their mouth. God uses his sovereignty to oppose the proud, but to bless the humble. So therefore, as we move into the future, we have to continue to submit ourselves to the Lord because he blesses the humble. We should never think that just because we're a church who's made it 175 years that we've got it all figured out. As soon as we begin to think that way, we'll be on the other side of what God is doing. We need to remain humble and recognize that it is only by God's faithfulness that we have been here for 175 years. It's only by God's faithfulness that we will continue. We need to be humble enough to follow God's word instead of what the world says. We need to be humble enough to follow God's design for our church instead of our desires for our church. We need to be humble because it's not only what God blesses, but it's in line with his heart and his character. This great reversal of God bringing the high to low and the low to high is really a picture of the gospel. God blesses the humble because it is in line with who he is. The Bible says that Jesus, though he was rich, for our sake he became poor, so that by his poverty, we who were poor might become rich. God himself was in a position of power and authority, and yet he brought himself low to save those of us who were low, to save those of us who were needy and hungry, who were wandering in the desert, as we saw earlier in this passage. He brought us in out of his own love, out of his own humility. And so we reflect his character when we continue to humble ourselves. So we continue to trust God in the future because he is sovereign. We submit to God because he blesses the humble. And then the psalm ends with a really simple point of application. It says in verse 43, whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let them consider the steadfast love of the Lord. This is what we're doing this morning, and this is what we need to continue to do in the future. We need to focus on God because his love is steadfast. The way we trust God with the future of our church, the way we keep seeking him and his faithfulness is to keep our focus on him. If we focus on our present circumstances, we will not be at peace. We will not have hope, maybe. It might go up and down depending upon how the economy is or what the job market is like or what's going on downtown. Even if we look within ourselves at our own church, we might be at times either too proud or too discouraged because we are keeping our focus on ourselves. But if we keep our focus on God, we will be reminded of his steadfast love. We'll be reminded of his faithfulness. I'm convinced that FirstSF has made it 175 years because this is what the church has done for those 175 years. That year after year, generation after generation, the church has kept its focus on God. Not been perfect. There's been times of straying, times of mistakes, but I think this church has kept their focus on God. And that is what allowed us to remain faithful because we see his faithfulness and his steadfast love. Church family, as we move into the future, let us continue to abide in his love. Let us continue to share his love with each other. Let us continue to share his love with the people around us. God has continued to place us here in the city of San Francisco, that we might be a city set on a hill, that we might be a light in the midst of this city, to continue to shine the steadfast love of the Lord to those who are around us. So church family, I believe if we keep our focus on God, not on our circumstances, not on what's going on in our church, but keep our focus on God, his steadfast love will be seen in our church and outside of our church for 175 years to come. So let us continue to move forward in the future,